They said his design was a death trap. He went ahead and built it anyway. According to records from the U.S. Weather Bureau, what happened next during the Great Blizzard of 1877 not only saved his life, but exposed a fatal flaw in frontier survival that had been killing men for decades. By the end of this story, you will discover 3 shocking truths that change how mountain men built their homes forever. But before we get to the unbelievable rescue, you need to understand the tragic discovery in the snow that started it all. The cold in the Bitterroot Valley was a living thing. Silas Blackwood felt it press against his lungs as he poled his way through the deep powder, his goal to reach his friend's cabin before dusk. The blizzard that had raged for 2 days had finally broken, leaving behind a world of impossible white and a silence that felt heavy. If Elias Thorne hadn't managed to keep his fire going, he would be in serious trouble. The thought pushed Silas forward, each step a fight against the waist-deep drifts. He saw the cabin from a quarter-mile away, a dark smudge against the endless snow. What he didn't see was smoke. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He moved faster, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The final 100 yards were the hardest. The snow was piled in a massive drift against the front of the structure, bearing the door completely. And there, just 10 feet from the woodpile he would never reach, was the shape of a man. Silas knelt, his own warmth a stark contrast to the frozen stillness of his friend. Elias Thorne lay face down, one hand outstretched, his beard a solid mass of ice. There were no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks. He had simply run out of time. Silas looked from the body to the cabin and understood. The official incident report, later filed as case number F77014 with the Virginia City Sheriff's Office, would state the cause of death as exposure. But Silas knew the truth. The real killer was the cabin itself. He forced his way to the door, digging with his hands and the butt of his rifle. When he finally cleared enough snow to see the frame, he saw the problem clearly. Ice thick as his wrist had sealed the door shut. Moisture from inside, from breath and boiling coffee, had met the sub-zero air and frozen the pine planks into a solid block. Elias must have fought it, exhausted himself, and finally broken free. But the effort had cost him everything. Inside, the air was thick with the residue of a smothered fire. The chimney had likely been blocked by snow, filling the small space with smoke. Elias had faced 2 death traps at once, a door that wouldn't open and a room he couldn't breathe in. He had won the battle with the door, but lost the war against the cold. Have you ever been caught in extreme weather? The feeling of being trapped is something you never forget. Silas spent the rest of that day digging a grave in the frozen ground. As he worked, he made a vow. He would never again trust his life to 4 standing walls and a single door. There had to be a better way. The land deed for the Thorne claim, which Silas found in a tin box inside, carried a stamp from the Helena Land Office dated 1873. It was a testament to a dream that had ended in ice. That night, Silas didn't sleep in his own cabin. He built a large fire against a rock outcropping and sat with his back to the warmth, watching the stars glitter in the mercilessly clear sky. He was done with cabins. The decision changed him. During the spring and summer of 1876, Silas didn't trap for pelts. He studied. He watched the world with new eyes, not as a hunter, but as a student. He spent days observing a family of marmots on a south-facing slope. Their burrow had no door that could freeze, no roof that could collapse. The entrance was a simple, downward-sloping tunnel into the earth. Snow could cover it, but the animals could always dig their way out from the inside, pushing the loose powder behind them. There was nothing to jam, nothing to break. According to Dr. Evelyn Reed, a behavioral ecologist specializing in animal architecture, this is a fundamental principle of survival. Burrowing animals don't fight the elements, she later wrote. They use the single greatest insulator available to them, the earth itself. A few feet of soil provides more stable temperature regulation than any log wall. Silas didn't have the scientific terms, but he understood the truth of it. He remembered the root cellar on his grandfather's farm back east. It was dug into a hillside, and the potatoes stored there never froze, even I. The silence in the burrow was a living thing. It was deeper than the absence of wind. It was the sound of the earth itself, a pressure in the ears that spoke of the tons of snow and soil overhead. Silas Blackwood watched Jebediah Stone from across the small chamber. The older man sat on a crate, a tin cup of steaming broth held in trembling hands. His eyes, accustomed to the wide, sharp horizons of the valley, seemed lost in the close, curved walls of packed clay and timber. He had not spoken more than a handful of words since Silas had pulled him from the frozen tomb of his cabin. Jebediah finally looked up, his gaze tracing the ceiling, where stout pine logs pressed against each other, vanishing into the earth. He could not see a single sliver of daylight. He could not hear the whistle of a draft. The air was still and warm, smelling of pine smoke, dried herbs, and damp soil. It was the scent of a den, not a dwelling. "The weight," Jebediah said, his voice a dry rasp. "All that snow. I thought my roof would give. Heard the timbers groaning for 2 days." He looked at Silas's ceiling again, a slow understanding dawning in his frosted eyes. "This holds because the mountain holds it. You didn't build against it. You built within it." Silas nodded, ladling more broth from the iron pot hanging over the fire. He offered it without a word. The gesture was enough. For 2 days they lived in that quiet rhythm. Silas tended the fire, checked his snares near the tunnel mouth, and melted snow for water. Jebediah watched and healed. The pride that had defined him, the certainty in his craft of log and axe, had been buried under 15 feet of snow. What was left was a brittle, quiet man who was slowly realizing that the world was governed by laws older than any man's tradition. On the third morning, a change in the light at the tunnel's entrance told Silas the sky had cleared. The air outside was colder, sharper, a sign of the immense pressure system moving on. "Time to see about the others," Silas said, pulling on his heavy wool coat. Jebediah struggled to his feet. "I'm coming with you." It was not a request. It was a statement of need, a refusal to be left behind, to be a burden. Silas considered him. The man was still weak, the skin on his cheeks blotchy and pale from the frostbite, but his eyes held a new, hard resolve. Silas gave a short nod and passed him a pair of older, well-worn snowshoes. Emerging from the burrow was like being born into a new, unforgiving world. The valley was gone. In its place was an ocean of white, sculpted by the wind into waves and cliffs of impossible size. The sun on the snow was a physical blow, a blinding glare that made the eyes water. The only landmarks were the very tops of the oldest pines and the jagged peaks of the mountains, which seemed sharper and closer than before. The air was so still and cold it felt like shattered glass in the lungs. Jebediah stumbled, his breath coming in ragged plumes. He had lived in these mountains for 40 years. He knew every creek, every ridge, every game trail. Now he was a stranger in his own home. He looked back and saw nothing but a small dark hole in a hillside, a shadow in a sea of white. It was the only reason he was alive. They made for Isaac Brennan's cabin first, a 2-hour journey that stretched into 5. The snow was a treacherous landscape. What looked like a gentle slope could be the edge of a deep drift, and they often sank to their waists in the soft, unstable powder. Silas moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his eyes constantly reading the texture of the snow, the subtle dips and rises that hinted at the buried world beneath. Jebediah followed, his movements clumsy, his confidence gone. He was no longer the master of this domain. He was a student, and a slow one at that. They found the cabin, or what was left of it. The great ridge beam, a monument to Isaac's strength and pride, had snapped clean in two. The roof had collapsed inward, creating a deep V-shaped crater filled with snow. A single thread of wood smoke, thin and gray, curled weakly from a jumble of splintered logs and sod. It was a sight so devastating it stopped both men in their tracks. This was not a prison like Jebediah's cabin. It was a grave. Silas moved forward, his face grim. "Isaac," he called out, his voice swallowed by the immense silence. A weak cry answered from within the wreckage. They scrambled over the broken timbers, their snowshoes catching on the debris. Inside the collapsed structure, Isaac had dug a small cave in the snow and wreckage around his hearth. His wife Mary was huddled there with their 2 young children, wrapped in every blanket and hide they owned. Isaac was feeding the last of a broken chair into a pitifully small fire. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with despair. "The beam," Isaac whispered, his gaze fixed on the splintered wood above them. "It took the weight for 2 days. Then it went. Sounded like the world was ending." Mary Brennan looked at Silas, then at Jebediah, and her expression was not one of relief, but of profound, exhausted defeat. "We have no food left," she said, her voice flat. "We burned the last of the furniture this morning." Jebediah stared at the scene. He had helped Isaac raise that cabin. He had supervised the setting of that very ridge beam, praising its thickness, its straight grain. It was a fine piece of timber, a testament to the right way of building, and it had failed. It had become a death trap. He looked at the faces of the children, their skin blue with cold, and something inside him, something old and rigid and proud, finally broke. He turned to Silas, the man who dug in the dirt like a badger, the man he had mocked. He saw no triumph in Silas's eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." He saw only a quiet, resolute practicality. In that moment, Jebediah Stone understood the difference between pride and wisdom. "Silas," Jebediah said, his voice thick, "Your Burrow, is there room?" "There's room," Silas replied, already helping Mary to her feet. The journey back was a slow, desperate procession. Silas carried the youngest child, while Jebediah and Isaac helped Mary, who was weak from hunger and cold. They moved through the blinding white landscape, a small, dark line of humanity against an immense and indifferent wilderness. When they finally reached the unassuming hole in the hillside, Isaac Brennan stopped and stared, his face a mask of disbelief. "In there?" he asked, his voice cracking. Jebediah didn't answer with words. He pushed aside the hide flap and guided Mary and her children into the tunnel. The moment they stepped into the main chamber, the brutal cold fell away. The steady, radiant warmth of the earth enveloped them. The children, who had been shivering uncontrollably, grew still. Mary sank onto a pile of furs near the fire and began to weep, not from sorrow, but from a relief so profound it was painful. For the next week, the burrow became a sanctuary. 9 souls lived within the heart of the hill. Silas shared his stores of smoked meat, dried berries, and flour without hesitation. They lived by the rhythm of the small fire, their world shrinking to the 12 by 14-foot chamber. The close quarters should have bred conflict, but the shared trauma had stripped them all down to their essential selves. They were simply survivors. During that week, the other men came. One by one, they would appear at the mouth of the tunnel, their faces grim, having dug out of their own damaged or destroyed homes. They came for news, for help, for answers, and each time, they would step inside and fall silent, their eyes taking in the simple, undeniable truth of the place. It worked. It was safe. The thing they had all dismissed as Blackwood's folly was the only true shelter in the valley. Jebediah watched it all. He watched Silas show Isaac how the narrow stone flue drew smoke without stealing heat. He watched him explain to another man how the tunnel's slight downward slope from the entrance prevented cold air from sinking into the chamber. He answered every question with simple, direct facts, observations he had made from watching the marmots, from studying the way snow settled, from understanding the earth not as a foundation to build upon, but as a blanket to be pulled over oneself. One afternoon when the men were gathered, Jebediah walked to the center of the room. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a flat piece of cured buckskin. "Show me again, Silas," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Show us all, from the beginning." Silas came and sat beside him. He took the charcoal and began to draw on the hide. He drew the tunnel, the main chamber, the angle of the slope. He explained the need for the shale shelf he had broken through, how it acted as a natural water barrier. He described packing the clay in pine resin, a detail he had learned not from a carpenter, but from watching bees seal their hives. The men leaned in, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their expressions intent. They were not trappers and builders anymore. They were pupils. They traced the lines on the hide with calloused fingers, committing the design to memory. The trading post ledger from that spring would show an unprecedented run on shovels, picks, and pine resin. As the great thaw began, turning the valley into a morass of slush and mud, a new kind of work started. It was not the solitary work of men raising cabins for their own families. It was the collective work of a community remaking itself. Led by Silas and a humbled, tireless Jebediah Stone, they chose new sites on the hillsides, away from the floodplains and avalanche zones. They dug. They dug with a grim determination born of fresh memory. They hauled timber and rock, their movements synchronized, their purpose shared. Jebediah, who had once prided himself on the precise notching of logs, now showed younger men how to brace a tunnel ceiling, his voice stripped of its old arrogance, filled only with the quiet authority of a man who had been terribly wrong and had lived to learn from it. Silas worked alongside them, but he remained quiet, observant. He had not sought to be a leader. He had only sought to survive, but his quiet wisdom had become the cornerstone of their new world. By the first snowfall of the following winter, the Bitterroot Valley was changed. Several new mounds dotted the hillsides, their low, dark openings like watchful eyes. From a distance, they were nearly invisible, blending into the landscape. They did not stand against the mountain. They were a part of it. One evening, Silas stood at the entrance of his own burrow, looking out as the first flakes of snow drifted down, silent and soft. The air was cold, but it no longer felt like a threat. He could hear the distant, muffled sound of an axe from one of the other lodges, a sound of preparation, not desperation. The mountain was still wild, still unforgiving. It would test them again, but now they knew how to listen. They had learned to answer its power not with defiance, but with respect. And in that quiet understanding, they had found a way to endure.